Claire woke up that morning feeling a familiar heaviness in her chest, the kind that always surfaced whenever she thought about her kid brother, Eric. Every day began the same way. She'd open her eyes in the dark, stare at the peeling wallpaper overhead, and wish there was some miracle that could make his health problems go away. Eric had been diagnosed with a chronic lung condition a few months earlier, and the costs of his medications were crushing her finances more than she ever could have imagined. As she tiptoed out of the cramped bedroom they shared, she glanced at her brother's pale face. He was still asleep, taking shallow breaths that sounded too labored for someone his age. She wanted nothing more than to see him live a normal, carefree life, one without doctor's appointments constantly looming. Quietly, Claire pulled on a worn-out sweater, slipped into her shoes, and made her way to the kitchen. It was so tiny that when she extended her arms, she nearly touched the walls on each side. The fridge rattled when she opened it, revealing little more than a half-eaten container of yogurt, 2 apples, and a carton of milk nearing its expiration date. She shook her head and suppressed a sigh. Time was short. She had to leave for work soon, and it would be another long shift of cleaning endless hallways in the towering office building downtown. The building, called Crescent Heights Tower, housed some of the city's most influential people. If anyone had told her a year ago that she would end up cleaning floors for wealthy entrepreneurs and high-profile executives, she wouldn't have believed them. But life had thrown her a curveball, and here she was. On her way out, she carefully placed a glass of water and Eric's pill bottle on the battered nightstand by his bed. She scribbled a short note telling him not to worry, though he likely would anyway, and then slipped out the door. Outside, the late autumn wind cut across her cheeks, already giving them a raw, prickly feeling. She walked to the bus stop, her eyes half focused on the cracked sidewalk under her feet, half on the exhausted reflection looking back at her in the windows she passed. Crescent Heights Tower rose like a giant mirrored sword against the dull morning sky, its upper floors hidden by low-hanging clouds that threatened more rain. Claire hesitated in the lobby, steeling herself for another day. She wondered if the people who strode in and out noticed the cleaning staff's reflection in those polished floors. Probably not. Most days she liked being ignored because it allowed her to move swiftly and do her job without too many awkward interactions. But ignoring the cleaning staff also meant ignoring their struggles. She took the employee elevator down to the basement level, changed into her light blue uniform, and grabbed a cart laden with mops, cleaning solutions, rags, and a broom. The handle of the broom had long since splintered, wrapped in duct tape by someone who must have had the same frustration she felt about the company's reluctance to replace old supplies. Still, she was grateful for any sort of stable job. Medical bills were piling up, and her paychecks disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. The building's corridors were typically pristine, with glossy marble floors reflecting rows of abstract paintings on the walls. Most workers hurried past her. She learned to keep her head down, a friendly but slight smile on her lips in case someone said hello. Few ever did. That day, however, felt different from the moment she stepped onto the main floor to start her routine. A flurry of urgent footsteps echoed in the halls. Associates in sharp suits, a swirl of tense voices behind the glass conference rooms, and a general sense that something important was about to happen. She heard mentions of a major deal, foreign investors, and Daniel Sheridan, the building's owner and CEO of the Sheridan Group. The man was somewhat of a legend, a millionaire, or maybe a billionaire, who had built his empire from scratch. At least, that's what people said. Claire had only caught glimpses of him from afar, tall and imposing with a perfectly fitted suit, never a hair out of place. He was known for being cool under pressure and absolutely ruthless in negotiations. Claire's responsibilities that morning included tidying the corridor outside the executive conference wing. She quietly pushed her cleaning cart along, noticing the hush that fell whenever she passed a group of employees. She knew about an upcoming meeting scheduled for that morning, some critical negotiation that, rumor had it, would either boost the Sheridan Group to unprecedented heights or cost them a fortune if it went wrong. She tried to keep her mind on her work, wiping down a brass railing here, dusting a corner there, but the tension around her was impossible to ignore. People spoke in hushed whispers, and she caught glimpses of meticulously arranged fruit trays, suits that cost more than her rent, and the cold stares of corporate lawyers waiting to pounce on any mistakes. She was used to the air of intimidation that lingered near the upper floors. But something about this day felt even more intense. Eventually, she saw Daniel Sheridan himself step out of an elevator accompanied by his closest advisors. He wasn't smiling. His jaw was set in a hard line, and though his expression was neutral, it was clear he meant business. Claire tried to slip away quietly, but ended up just a few feet behind him as he turned down a hallway leading to a large conference room. He didn't even glance her way. She figured it was best to keep her distance. Inside the conference room, people were already seated around a long, polished table. There were men in sleek, tailored suits and women with expertly styled hair and expensive jewelry. She recognized the older man at the far end of the table from a magazine cover, Leonard Pierce, an investor rumored to have questionable ethics. She had read an article about him months back. Something about how he had a knack for quietly absorbing smaller companies and dismantling them for profit. Some people said he had personally ruined hundreds of families by slashing jobs and benefits. Claire felt her stomach twist as she recalled some details about one scandal in particular. He had bankrupted an entire community's small businesses, and those folks never recovered. Her job that morning was to ensure the corridor was spotless before the meeting began. She tried to wrap up quickly as the lawyers and executives filled the room. The door was left slightly ajar, maybe by mistake, or maybe so latecomers could slip inside without causing disruption. She had no intention of eavesdropping, but as she moved to gather her cleaning supplies, she heard Mr. Pierce's voice, deep and insistent, pressing Daniel Sheridan to sign a contract as soon as possible. It made her skin prickle. She inched a little closer, inadvertently catching fragments of the conversation. She heard bold promises of huge returns, talk of unstoppable expansions, and casual references to cutting some corners if necessary. It set off alarms in her mind. Her gut feeling, shaped by reading about Pierce's past deals, was that something was profoundly wrong. At first, Claire tried to shrug off the creeping sense of dread. Who was she to meddle in the affairs of powerful men in suits? But she was reminded of the scandal that had nearly ruined her hometown when she was a kid. That fiasco had taught her something. Unscrupulous business deals could tear families apart. She found herself unable to look away from the room's threshold. Everything in her wanted to turn around and forget she'd overheard anything, but a stronger impulse pushed her to linger. Daniel Sheridan's usually calm voice sounded slightly strained as the conversation progressed. He questioned certain clauses, but Pierce and his associates kept dismissing his concerns, insisting that signing was just a formality. Claire's heart began pounding. She realized she was holding her breath. All she knew was that Pierce had a history of manipulating deals so that only he benefited while others lost everything. Claire remembered the article describing families who'd lost their homes. She felt a wave of anxiety and an odd sense of responsibility. Could she let this go and watch it happen again? Possibly on an even bigger scale. Her gaze flicked around, half expecting security to catch her loitering near the door. She was one step away from running, but something in her locked in place. She recalled how helpless she'd felt as a teen watching her own community crumble. She remembered her father's tears when he was laid off and how her mother had scrambled to keep their small flower shop open, only to close it a year later. If only someone had warned them earlier about the shady investor who eventually bought and liquidated half the town. Now that same uneasy feeling buzzed in her mind. Without fully understanding her own motivation, she pushed the conference room door open a little wider and cleared her throat. The entire room went silent as if someone had cut a power cord. Heads whipped around, and Claire realized too late what she had just done. Daniel Sheridan stared at her, eyebrows slightly raised. "Mr." Pierce cast her a cold glare that made her stomach knot. The tension in the air was suffocating. Claire's heart thundered in her ears. She tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out right. Finally, in a trembling tone, she managed, "Sir? Mr. Sheridan. I know this isn't my place, but please don't sign that contract." Her voice barely reached above a whisper, but in the hush of that moment it was startlingly loud. Daniel's face revealed shock and a flicker of annoyance. The lawyers around the table looked equally stunned, and Mr. Pierce's expression darkened. Somebody near the door coughed uncomfortably. Every second felt like an eternity as Claire forced herself to continue, her throat parched and her hands visibly shaking. I read about Mr. Pierce's business deals before. He's not to be trusted. People have lost everything. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to... Her words stumbled into silence as she realized she might be about to lose her job, all on a gut instinct. As she expected, the first reaction came from one of Daniel's advisors, who barked, "How dare you interrupt this meeting? Who are you?" Another voice demanded security remove her immediately. Claire's eyes darted to Daniel, searching for even a hint of understanding. She could see that he was furious at the breach of protocol. His jaw was tensed and he was gripping the edge of the table. But something else flickered across his face. Doubt, maybe, or curiosity. He locked eyes with her for a long second. Claire's words trembled, but she forced them out. "I'm just a cleaning lady, but This contract could ruin you, sir." Pierce erupted in indignation, pounding his fist on the table. "This is outrageous," he spat, glaring daggers at Claire. "You're going to take the word of some eavesdropping janitor? Daniel, let's finalize our agreement and put this nonsense behind us." Pierce's associates murmured angrily, clearly offended that their high-stakes negotiation was being questioned by a low-level employee. Claire stood there, her palms damp, her heart threatening to break free of her ribcage. She braced herself to be escorted out in shame. But before she could move, Daniel raised a hand, halting the guards who had just arrived in the doorway. He regarded Claire as though trying to solve a riddle, his grey eyes studying her rumpled uniform, the colour drained from her cheeks. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like a physical presence. "Why?" he asked at last, his voice low and surprisingly calm. "Why would you stick your neck out like this?" She swallowed hard. Because I've seen people get hurt by deals like this," she answered, her voice quivering. "I've seen families lose everything to men who talk big, promising huge payouts, but then vanish once they've taken what they want. I know I have no right to interfere, but I couldn't just watch it happen again. I'm sorry." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. Finally, he turned to the room. "Give us a minute." Pierce opened his mouth to protest, but Daniel's glacial glare quelled him. The lawyers hesitated, then slowly filed out, casting suspicious looks at Claire. Pierce, face taut with anger, followed them. Claire stood near the door, bewildered by what was happening. When they were alone, Daniel leaned against the table and folded his arms. "I should fire you on the spot," he said, each word measured. "You nearly blew up a multi-million-dollar deal." Claire stared at the floor. "I understand. I'm sorry." He inhaled, and for a moment she expected him to unleash his wrath. Instead, he closed his eyes and exhaled. "But I won't. Not yet, anyway. Is there something specific you know about Pierce that I don't? Or are you relying on rumors and hearsay?" Claire shook her head, wishing she could hide behind her mop bucket. "I only know what I read and what I saw happen in my hometown. It was enough for me to realize he's not trustworthy. He's an expert at sweet-talking executives into bad deals." Daniel didn't respond right away. He picked up a folder on the table, one that presumably contained the contract. For a second, he seemed lost in thought. Then he turned back to her. "This conversation is over. Go back to your duties," he said tersely. "And if you value your job, or any job, you'll keep quiet about this." She gave a slight nod and hurried out, the sting of shame and fear coursing through her. That afternoon was a blur. Claire half expected to be fired before she could even finish her shift. Each time an elevator chimed, her pulse raced, certain it was security coming to escort her away. But nothing happened. By the time she clocked out, her nerves were shredded and her thoughts were spinning with a grim sense of doom. How on earth would she afford Eric's medication without this job? By the time she got home, she found Eric curled on their threadbare couch, flipping through an old comic book. He perked up when she walked in, but his cheeks were flushed, and she could tell he was running a mild fever again. "Hey, sis," "You look beat," he said, glancing with concern at the slump in her shoulders. She managed a weak smile. "Long day, that's all. How are you feeling?" "Like someone is squeezing my lungs." He tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough. "But I'll be okay. What's for dinner?" A pang of guilt tugged at her. She knew she hadn't bought groceries in a while, and she had no idea how to address his medical bills if her job was truly at risk. She rustled up a modest meal, some leftover rice, scrambled eggs, and a handful of wilted spinach. She pretended it was a gourmet feast, teasing Eric to make him laugh. He appreciated her effort, but she could see the worry in his eyes, the same worry that had been etched on her face all day. That night, Claire could hardly sleep. She tossed and turned, replaying every detail of her impulsive decision to barge into that meeting. Had she done the right thing? She felt sure Pierce was shady, but had she gone about it the wrong way? If Daniel Sheridan fired her tomorrow, what would happen to her and Eric? But amid the uncertainty, she also felt a spark of conviction. She hadn't lied. She had told Daniel the truth. Pierce was not to be trusted. Whether he would heed that warning or ignore it remained to be seen. The next morning, Claire arrived at Crescent Heights Tower with anxiety gnawing at her like a stray dog on a bone. She was convinced that any second she'd be handed a pink slip, yet to her astonishment, no such thing happened. The day began like any other. She changed into her uniform in the basement locker room, then headed upstairs to scrub floors and wipe counters. The tension of the previous day seemed to have died down. The suits in the corridor looked busy, but calmer. At lunch, she sat alone in a tucked-away corner, poking at a soggy sandwich. A colleague from the cleaning staff, Naomi, plopped down beside her with a concerned look. "I heard some rumors," Naomi whispered. "Something about you walking in on an important meeting. Everyone's talking about it. What happened?" Claire stiffened, scanning the area to ensure no one else was listening. I guess I got carried away. I'm worried I'll get fired soon, so don't be surprised if..." Naomi grimaced. "I can't believe you'd risk it all like that." "You must have had a good reason." Claire shrugged, too drained to elaborate. She wrapped up lunch quickly, returning to her duties with her stomach in knots. Every time she turned a corner, she half expected to see Daniel Sheridan standing there pointing an accusatory finger at her. But it was nearly mid-afternoon before she actually encountered him. She was in the hallway outside the executive offices emptying a trash bin when she felt a presence behind her. Turning around, she found Daniel Sheridan watching her with the same cool expression he'd worn the previous day. Her pulse quickened. "Mr. Sheridan," she murmured, lowering her gaze. He gave a polite nod. "Claire, is it?" She nodded, unable to form words. She wanted to apologize, or perhaps explain, but her tongue felt heavy. Daniel stepped closer, scanning the corridor to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "I checked up on Pierce after our conversation," he said. "He's definitely been involved in some questionable dealings. So I've told my legal team to stall. We're reviewing the contract more carefully now." Her heart leapt. Maybe she had helped. Maybe her impulsive action had saved Daniel from a terrible partnership. But would he resent her for undermining the negotiations in the first place? "Thank you for listening," Claire said softly. "I know I overstepped." He waved a hand. "You did? But that doesn't mean you were wrong." Then, in a gentler voice, he asked, "Why did you do it?" "I don't see people rushing to protect me from bad deals every day. Especially not employees who could lose their jobs just for speaking out." She swallowed, glancing at the tiles beneath her feet. "I've seen this kind of thing before," she admitted. "People with power and wealth stepping on smaller communities, smaller families. My brother's health depends on me having stable work, but I still couldn't stand by and let someone else's life get ruined, even if you are a powerful man. It would have weighed on my conscience forever." For a moment he said nothing, and she wondered if she'd said too much. Then he gave a single curt nod and turned away. Before walking off, he muttered, "You have guts, Claire. Don't waste them." And with that, he was gone. She remained frozen in the hallway, her mind spinning. A small sense of relief washed over her. He wasn't firing her, at least not yet. He had even shown what could almost be described as respect. She finished her shift feeling a bit lighter, though her life was still far from easy. That evening, she managed to buy a few groceries with the last of her spare cash. Eric was curled up in blankets on the couch, coughing softly. But when he saw her with a bag of fresh fruit and a small carton of ice cream, his eyes lit up. It was a tiny moment of joy in a bleak time. The next few days passed without incident. Daniel Sheridan didn't summon her, nor did he drop by to talk. Word trickled through the grapevine that negotiations with Pierce had hit a snag. But no one seemed to know exactly why. Claire kept her head down, as always, focusing on her tasks and trying to ignore curious whispers from co-workers who had heard rumors. She avoided the executive floors more than she needed to, worried about running into Daniel again. On one hand, she was grateful he had taken her warning seriously. On the other, she feared she'd thrown a wrench into something important, and maybe he was just biding his time before letting her go. Then, one late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, she stepped into the break room to grab her coat and head home. She found Daniel waiting there, leaning against a table with his arms folded. She almost dropped her coat in surprise. The hush of the empty room made her heart gallop. "I've been looking for you," he said, cutting straight to the point. "We need to talk." She nodded warily, not trusting herself to speak yet. She was still in her powder blue uniform, shoes squeaking on the tiles. He took a long look at her. "Pierce tried to push me into signing the revised contract. I told him I needed more time for my lawyers to examine it. He wasn't happy. Stormed out of the office, threatened to pull out of the deal." Claire found her voice. "I'm sorry if—" "Don't apologize," Daniel interrupted, surprisingly calm. "You likely saved me from a financial catastrophe. Half the clauses in that contract are designed to benefit him at our expense. My legal team discovered all sorts of hidden penalties if the deal went south. We'd have lost more money than we put in." She exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. "I'm relieved. Truly." He cocked his head. "Here's my question. Why take such a risk? Are you just that altruistic, or do you have some personal stake in all of this? Maybe you're connected to one of Pierce's past victims," Claire stammered. My family lost our small business years ago because of a shady investor. Someone like Pierce. I recognized his name from a news piece. My dad never recovered from the blow. We lost everything. I guess I've become a little too sensitive when I see someone pulling the same tricks." Daniel's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said, his voice quieter than before. "But you should have told me that's where you recognized him from." She gave a shaky laugh. "I'm just the cleaning lady. I didn't think you'd believe me. Powerful men don't often listen to people like me." He gave a soft grunt. "Usually no. But you came in with no motive other than to warn me. That's unusual. You don't see that kind of integrity every day." Then, as though catching himself, he straightened up. "I appreciate it. That's all I wanted to say." She flashed him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you. I mean, for hearing me out, and for not firing me, which you still totally can." Daniel didn't smile back, but there was a faint warmth in his eyes. "I don't reward honesty by firing people. You taught me to look harder at something I might have signed blindly. I owe you for that." Claire's cheeks burned. She felt odd discussing matters so frankly with the CEO in a dingy break room, but she couldn't deny the tiny spark of hope flickering in her chest. Maybe her life was starting to turn a corner. She offered him a nod and quietly excused herself, heading out into the crisp evening air. All the way home, her mind whirled with conflicting emotions: relief, pride, a tugging sense of vulnerability. She had opened up about her family's past to a man who was practically a stranger. But there was also gratitude. Whatever Daniel Sheridan's reputation for coldness and ruthlessness, he had recognized something in her warnings, enough to reconsider a major decision. She hugged her coat tighter against the chill wind and allowed herself the briefest smile. Eric was waiting for her with an anxious look. "You're late," he said from the couch. "I was worried." "Another rough day?" Claire shook her head. "Surprisingly, no. A weird day, but not rough." She explained in broad strokes that her job was secure for now. The fear she'd been carrying around all week began to ease. Eric squeezed her hand, relief washing over his face. That's good. We can't afford you losing any more pay, especially now. It was clear he hated the burden his health placed on her. She tried to reassure him that it wasn't his fault, that families take care of each other. But the conversation made her reflect anew on her precarious situation. One slip-up at work could cost her everything. She resolved to keep her head down from now on, despite the unexpected turn of events. For a while, that's exactly what she did. She arrived early, left late, and handled her cleaning duties diligently. She barely caught glimpses of Daniel. Now and then, she'd see him striding through the halls with a purposeful scowl, or overhear staff whispering about the upcoming renegotiations with Pierce or other deals in the pipeline. She forced herself to stay uninvolved, focusing only on the paycheck that allowed her to buy Eric's medication. Yet as the days passed, she couldn't shake the memory of his look in the break room, that fleeting flicker of respect or curiosity in his eyes. Then, late one afternoon, she was vacuuming the plush carpets outside one of the executive lounges. The hum of the vacuum drowned out most background noise, so she didn't realize Daniel was behind her until she turned around. She jumped, nearly dropping the vacuum handle. He held up a hand apologetically. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you," she exhaled. "It's okay, Mr. Sheridan. I wasn't paying attention." "Daniel," he corrected, an odd softness in his voice. "We're not in front of the board. You can use my first name." She gave him a bewildered look. Why would he want that? He was still her boss, and an unbelievably important one at that. But she nodded. "Daniel," she echoed, feeling how strange it sounded on her tongue. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," he said, glancing around to make sure no one else was nearby. "I know you said you needed this job for your brother's medical expenses. If you don't mind me asking, how is he?" Her body tensed. Part of her wanted to snap. "That's private." But she also recognized a genuine tone of concern. Oddly, she found comfort in talking about Eric. She told Daniel about the doctor visits, the expensive inhalers, the nights she stayed up listening to Eric's strained breathing. Daniel listened quietly, a crease forming on his brow. "That must be tough," he said softly. I can't imagine what you're both going through." Claire nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude that he seemed to care. "We manage. Somehow." He hesitated, then offered a gentle statement. "If there's anything the company can do, like better insurance or something along those lines, maybe I can look into it." She was about to refuse, out of pride, but the reality of Eric's condition weighed heavily on her. If Daniel really could help, "I'd appreciate it," she murmured. "Even a slightly better health plan would make a world of difference." Daniel nodded, taking a mental note. "Let me see what I can do." Then he cleared his throat, shifting from personal concern to a more business-like manner. "By the way, we have an internal gathering next Friday. It's a sort of employee appreciation event. Food, drinks, a short awards ceremony. I'd like you to be there." She blinked. "Me? At an executive event? I don't think that's—" He lifted a hand, cutting her off. "You're invited. It's for everyone in the building, from top to bottom. Though not everyone attends. But I'd like you to come. There's something I'd like to discuss with you afterward. Something that might help your brother." Her mind swirled with questions. "All right," she agreed softly, wondering what on earth he was planning. He nodded, a faint smile ghosting his lips, and strode away. Claire turned back to her vacuum, her heart fluttering with a swirl of anticipation, gratitude, and nerves. She finished vacuuming the corridor, her thoughts still entangled in that brief exchange with Daniel. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks, and by the time she left work, the sun had set, leaving the building's reflective facade glowing in a wash of orange city light. She boarded the bus home, resting her head against the window and watching street lamps flick past in staccato flashes. Despite her fatigue, her mind kept circling back to Friday's event. Why did Daniel want her there? Was it purely to discuss insurance options for Eric? Or was there a deeper agenda? She arrived home to find Eric sitting up in bed, looking at the family's battered old laptop. He coughed a greeting, then motioned for her to come over. He'd stumbled upon some new medical research that piqued his interest, a potential trial for patients with chronic lung conditions, but it was in another state. She could see the longing and hope in his eyes, and she hated how powerless she felt. She rummaged through the kitchen for something to eat, eventually preparing a simple bowl of soup. Eric joined her at the small table they shared. Between spoons of broth, he asked, "How was work? Anything interesting happen?" She weighed how much to share. Finally, she admitted that the CEO had expressed concern for her situation and might help them get better insurance. Eric's eyes lit up with a cautious kind of optimism. "That's surprising," he said, setting his spoon down. "You sure he's not just stringing you along?" "I don't think so," Claire replied softly. "He seems genuine. I guess we'll find out soon enough." She didn't want to get Eric's hopes up in case it fell through. One thing she'd learned was never to rely too heavily on promises. Still, she couldn't deny a flicker of hope that this could turn into a real lifeline. All week, she caught herself glancing at the clock, counting the days until Friday's event. The building buzzed with preparations. Someone hung strings of tiny white lights along the common areas. An elaborate array of catered hors d'oeuvres appeared in the employee lounge, and the front desk staff practiced greeting VIP guests with polished smiles. Claire did her usual chores, but felt more keenly aware of all the hustle. When Friday finally arrived, she slipped into a knee-length navy dress she'd once bought for a friend's wedding and had rarely worn since. The edges of the sleeves were a little frayed, but it was still her nicest outfit. She left Eric at home with some groceries and extra blankets, promising to be back soon. The event was held in a large reception hall on the top floor, which Claire had rarely visited. City lights stretched out in every direction, and floor-to-ceiling windows gave a panoramic view of glittering traffic and high-rises. She lingered near the entrance, feeling out of place among the sharp suits and cocktail dresses. A few of her colleagues from the cleaning crew had shown up as well, but they all gravitated to the periphery like she did, uncertain how to blend in. She caught sight of Daniel by a glossy, modern bar set up in one corner, talking to a small circle of upper-level managers. He looked as impeccably put together as ever, in a tailored charcoal suit. Though he was the center of that little crowd, his gaze drifted across the room until it landed on her. He excused himself and crossed the space, wearing an expression she might have described as pleasant, if not for the underlying intensity in his eyes. "You made it," he said, his voice low but friendly. Claire nodded, unconsciously tugging at a loose thread on her sleeve. "I did. It's nice up here. The view is amazing." "It is," he agreed, following her gaze to the windows. "Look, if you don't mind, I'd like to speak somewhere quieter. There's a small lounge down the hall that's empty tonight." She felt tension coil in her stomach. All kinds of scenarios whirled in her head. Was he going to make her sign some form? Or maybe present a contract that guaranteed better insurance if she did him some favor in return? Trying to steady her pulse, she nodded again, murmuring a quick goodbye to the cleaning staff members who were watching the exchange with poorly disguised intrigue. He led her through a corridor lined with abstract paintings, and then opened a door leading to a cozy sitting area. The soft amber glow of a table lamp illuminated 2 chairs and a small sofa. A muted city skyline spread out beyond a wide window. He gestured for her to take a seat, then closed the door behind them, shutting out the hum of the gathering. "I didn't bring you here just to talk about insurance," Daniel began, sitting in one of the chairs and leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Though that's part of it. I've been looking into ways to overhaul our company's healthcare plan. You're not the only employee who's struggling with medical bills. We're exploring an upgraded plan that covers more specialized treatments." Claire's chest felt lighter at the possibility. That's wonderful. If you could do that, He lifted a hand gently. "But it's not finalized yet. I'm still meeting with the HR director and a few board members. I'll keep you updated." Then he paused, his gaze flickering over her as though debating whether to continue. "There's another matter." She shifted in her seat, bracing herself. "Yes?" He steepled his fingers, his tone quieter. Pierce's attempt to pressure us into that contract didn't end with him storming out. He's been trying to undermine our company's reputation with some negative press leaks. I can't prove it yet, but I'm almost certain he's the source of a few alarming articles about the Sheridan Group's financial instability. We're not in trouble, he clarified, but rumors can damage stock prices. He's playing a long game, hoping we'll come crawling back on his terms. She absorbed his words with growing unease. So what are you going to do? Investigate. Gather evidence. I have investigators looking into his connections. I'm also reviewing other potential partners for the expansion, because we can't just abandon that project. But I wanted to ask you something. He paused, watching her face closely. She swallowed. What is it? He exhaled, the lines around his mouth tightening. Have you or your family been approached by anyone, asking questions about me or about the company? Sometimes people try to manipulate employees into feeding them inside information. Claire blinked in surprise. No one's contacted me. Then she tilted her head, confusion evident. Why would anyone think I'd have valuable insider info? I'm just a cleaning lady, remember? Daniel's lips curved into a wry half-smile. Cleaning staff sees and hears a lot more than you think. Hallway conversations, papers left on desks. People underestimate you. If Pierce or anyone on his team thought you might be disgruntled, they could try to bribe you for whatever tidbits you've heard. A flash of indignation rose in her. I'd never betray the company like that. You gave me a stable job when I needed it most. He nodded. I know. I just want you to stay alert. If you sense anything off, if someone tries to get close to you for the wrong reasons, I want to know. She promised she would tell him immediately. A brief silence settled between them, filled only by the faint hum of ventilation. Claire noted how tired Daniel suddenly looked. The tension of the last few weeks must have weighed heavily on him. She remembered that under the polished suits and million-dollar negotiations, he was still a person, albeit one with more power than most. Unexpectedly, he let out a short, rueful laugh. I feel like I've had more real conversations with you in the past few weeks than I've had with most of my board of directors in months. They rarely tell me the truth. You, though, you rushed into that conference room without any regard for your own job, just to warn me. She blushed. I'm sorry if it was out of line. Out of line, yes, he agreed. But honest, and it saved me from walking into a trap. I suppose I'm not used to that kind of sincerity. She didn't know how to respond, so she offered a small smile. He checked his watch, a subtle signal the conversation was winding down. She wondered if he'd escort her back to the party, but instead he stood and opened the door. You can stay and enjoy the rest of the reception if you want, he said. There's plenty of food, and you might get a chance to chat with others from the building. Or you can head home. I know you probably need to be with your brother. Claire glanced at the corridor where festive music and chatter drifted in from the main hall. I think I'll say a quick hello to a few friends and then go. Thank you again. They parted ways. Claire tried to relax among the small crowd for a while. She nibbled on a handful of mini quiches and sipped a soft drink, but her mind lingered on the conversation in the lounge. Eventually, she slipped out and headed home, the city's neon reflections rippling in the puddles under her feet. She felt a strange new sense of purpose, as though she'd been pulled into something larger than herself. Eric was dozing when she returned, so she quietly covered him with an extra blanket and tried to get some sleep herself. Yet her thoughts buzzed with ideas. About the improved healthcare plan, about shady investors with hidden motives, and about the subtle vulnerability she'd glimpsed in Daniel's eyes. In the weeks that followed, the tension around Crescent Heights Tower didn't diminish. If anything, it grew sharper. Claire overheard employees whispering anxiously about the Sheridan Group's rumored instability, with some even worrying about potential layoffs. Daniel made occasional appearances on the executive floor, but she rarely saw him up close. When she did, he offered a curt nod or a quick hello before rushing off to some urgent meeting. She tried not to take it personally. He'd warned her about the negative press, and evidently his days were now consumed by damage control. Meanwhile, Eric had a severe flare-up of his lung condition. Claire scrambled to adjust her schedule, spending every moment not at work taking him to doctor visits. She managed to arrange some limited home health care, but it was still far from what he really needed. Every trip to the pharmacy drained her finances further. She found herself anxiously checking her bank balance, often finding it hovering uncomfortably close to zero. One afternoon, after a particularly hard day, Eric had been coughing non-stop and Claire was feeling hopeless. She decided to swallow her pride and visit the HR department. She'd heard rumors that new, improved insurance options might be announced soon. Maybe that was just gossip, but desperation trumped her usual shyness. She approached the HR assistant, who asked her to fill out some forms. Then she waited and waited in a stiff chair under fluorescent lights that made the place feel more like a hospital waiting room than an office. Finally, a man named Trevor, who introduced himself as a benefits coordinator, came out to see her. "I know Daniel mentioned something about expanding coverage," he said, scanning her file. "But these changes don't roll out officially until next quarter. We're still ironing out the details with the providers. I'm sorry. I don't have anything I can offer you right now that's significantly different from what you already have." Claire's shoulders slumped. "So there's no short-term solution? My brother needs daily medication that costs hundreds per month. He might be eligible for an experimental procedure too." Trevor shook his head regretfully. "Not at this time, but I promise. Once the new plan is finalized, you'll be among the first to know. I remember Daniel specifically mentioning your case." She muttered a polite thank you and left. Her mind spun with frustration. She knew she should be grateful that Daniel was trying at all, yet it still wasn't fast enough to meet Eric's immediate needs. With every passing week, Eric's condition worsened and her sense of dread grew. One evening, after Eric had finally fallen asleep, Claire was tidying the living room when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She nearly didn't answer, suspecting it was a telemarketer, but curiosity won out. A brisk male voice came on the line. "Am I speaking with Claire Peterson?" "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Stan Roberts. I'm an associate of Leonard Pierce. I understand you work at the Sheridan Group offices." She went cold. A knot formed in her stomach. So this was it. Exactly what Daniel had warned her about. She considered hanging up, but the man continued talking. "Mr. Pierce would like to discuss an opportunity with you. He knows you're close to Daniel Sheridan. He's prepared to offer generous compensation if you could help clarify certain details about the Sheridan Group's internal strategies." She stood in stunned silence. I'm sorry, I'm not interested." "Think carefully," Stan insisted, the slick confidence in his voice unsettling. "We know your brother is ill. We could help. Imagine if you never had to worry about his medical bills again. This wouldn't be espionage, just clarifications. A simple exchange of harmless bits of information. No one would get hurt." Her pulse pounded. This was a bribe, plain and simple, with a dash of blackmail thrown in for good measure. She forced her voice to stay calm. "No, I won't do it." Stan's sigh was audible through the phone. "Look, Miss Peterson, it's a big opportunity. Sleep on it. I'll call again in a few days. If your circumstances change, remember we're willing to pay. Handsomely." Before she could protest further, he hung up. Claire stood there, the phone still in her trembling hand, heart hammering in her chest. She stared at Eric, asleep in the next room, surrounded by pillows and inhalers. If she cooperated with Pierce's people, she might solve his financial woes in a heartbeat. But she knew the moral cost would destroy her. And besides, it would be a direct betrayal of Daniel's trust. She sank onto the couch, nausea swirling. She needed to tell Daniel. He had asked her to report any suspicious contact. Yet fear of dragging herself deeper into corporate warfare paralyzed her. Maybe she could handle it on her own. Maybe Pierce's team would back off if she refused firmly enough. But what if they didn't? What if they threatened her in a more direct way? Fear coiled tighter. The next morning at work, she walked around in a fog of anxiety. She nearly spilled her bucket of cleaning solution 3 separate times. Finally, she resolved she couldn't handle this alone. She had to tell Daniel. But the entire day passed without spotting him. His assistant claimed he was out at back-to-back meetings, and no one was sure when he'd return. Claire almost gave up, but at the end of her shift on her way to the bus stop, she saw him stepping out of a taxi by the main entrance. She must have looked frantic, rushing up to him as he paid the driver. He glanced at her with surprise. Claire, everything all right? She took a moment to catch her breath. No, there's something you need to know. She braced herself, feeling the swirl of tension that had built in her chest since that phone call. He read her expression and nodded. Let's talk inside. They re-entered the lobby. It was nearly empty. Most staff had already left for the evening. Under the stark glow of the chandelier, she relayed the phone call from Stan Roberts. She admitted Pierce's associate offered to cover all her brother's medical expenses if she shared insider details. Daniel's face darkened with anger. That snake, he muttered under his breath. I knew Pierce would stoop to manipulation, but blackmailing you with your brother's health is a new low. Claire felt tears threaten to surface. I don't know what to do. I'm scared they might not take no for an answer. He studied her face, then pressed his lips into a firm line. We'll handle it. Let me talk to my legal team and maybe even the authorities. Pierce can't just bribe or threaten employees into giving up company intel. Seeing her trembling, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Don't worry, Claire. You're not alone in this. I'll protect you. His words flooded her with relief. For the first time since that call, she felt a measure of safety. She even managed a faint smile. Thank you. I'm sorry to drag you into this. You're not dragging me into anything, he replied, stepping aside as a security guard walked past. Listen, if you ever feel unsafe at home or anywhere, call me. Day or night. Got it? She nodded, grateful but also overwhelmed by the precarious situation. She had only wanted a stable job to pay Eric's bills. Now she was in the crosshairs of a corporate feud. That night, as she caught the bus home, she stared out the window at the passing headlights and tried to calm the pounding in her ears. Daniel's promise echoed in her mind. I'll protect you. She wanted to believe it. In a world where powerful men often only looked out for themselves, Daniel's quiet assurance felt like a rare kindness. Eric was propped up on the couch, struggling with his inhaler when she arrived. She rushed over, helping him sit upright and breathe more easily. Once he stabilized, he studied her face. You look exhausted, he said gently. I hope you're not working yourself into an early grave. She forced a light laugh. I'm fine. Just a lot going on at work. She hated keeping secrets from him, but she didn't want him worrying about some corporate battle. He had enough on his plate. As days stretched into weeks, Daniel's vow to help Claire proved genuine. She received a pay raise that was small but incredibly helpful, followed by more supportive gestures, like grocery gift cards appearing in her locker with a short, unsigned note. For you and Eric. She knew who had left them. Though she felt a tinge of pride telling her to refuse charity, she realized accepting help might be the only way to ensure Eric got the nutrition and medication he needed. She also began receiving texts from a blocked number, clearly Stan Roberts, urging her to reconsider his proposal. She never answered. When these messages escalated into thinly veiled threats, she showed them to Daniel, whose anger flared. He told her he had a private investigator compiling evidence of Pierce's tactics. If all went well, they could press charges. One evening, Daniel caught up with her in the hall before she left. The investigator found something, he explained in a low voice, handing her a sealed envelope. It's background on Stan Roberts and Pierce's entire operation. And there's more. Proof they're sabotaging small companies citywide. We're building a legal case. Claire's eyes skimmed the document, stunned by the scope of Pierce's wrongdoing. It was bigger than she'd imagined. A labyrinth of shell companies designed to funnel money into secret accounts while systematically bankrupting anyone who posed a threat. I had no idea, she said softly. He's unstoppable, isn't he? Daniel's jaw clenched. No, we'll stop him. But we have to be careful. I don't want you in the line of fire. She stared at the pages, heart pounding. This was beyond just a business feud. It was an underhanded network that could ruin countless lives, much like how Claire's father's small business had been destroyed all those years ago. A flicker of resolve took hold in her. She raised her gaze to meet Daniel's. What can I do to help? He looked at her sharply. You've done enough just by refusing their bribe. Don't risk yourself further. She drew a breath. But I want to. For Eric, for my hometown, for everyone else Pierce has hurt. I can't sit back and let him do more damage if there's anything I can do to stop him. Something like admiration sparked in Daniel's eyes. I understand. But you're a key witness. If we bring these charges to the authorities, you might have to testify. Claire swallowed nervously. If that's what it takes, I'll do it. They stood in the corridor, the overhead lights flickering slightly, two people from vastly different worlds bound together by a common determination. Daniel placed a hand lightly on her arm. Let's proceed carefully then. We'll coordinate with the legal team. Promise me you'll prioritize your safety and Eric's. She nodded, aware of the potential consequences but oddly at peace with her choice. Together they made plans to forward the evidence to a trusted attorney, someone outside the usual circles that Pierce might have already infiltrated. Claire felt a resolve she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of reclaiming power she hadn't realized she'd lost. That weekend, Daniel called to check in on Eric's condition, and as they spoke, Claire found herself surprised by how easily the conversation flowed from business to personal matters. He asked about Eric's hobbies, her memories of their childhood, and the challenges of growing up in a struggling town. She, in turn, learned bits about his own background, how he'd come from a modest family before building his empire from a small tech startup. He seemed genuine, with real empathy for her struggles and more open than she'd ever imagined a titan of industry could be. In the weeks that followed, they spoke often, sometimes about medical tests for Eric, sometimes about the mounting evidence against Pierce. Each interaction subtly chipped away at the boundaries between employer and employee, forging an unexpected connection. The stress of corporate battles and Eric's health crisis still weighed on Claire, but Daniel's steady presence made it feel manageable. He was a man accustomed to isolating himself behind professional walls, yet he seemed to let her see cracks in that armor. She was grateful, yet cautious with her emotions, not wanting to blur lines that might complicate things further. As they waited for the attorney's counsel on how best to proceed, Pierce grew bolder. Articles popped up in tabloids accusing Daniel of mismanaging the Sheridan Group. Anonymous whistleblowers claimed the company was on the brink of collapse, fueling a mild dip in stock prices. Daniel's PR team scrambled to control the damage, releasing statements and data that showed the firm's stability. But for every rumor they squashed, another reappeared. Pierce was relentless. One cold evening, Claire got another call from Stan Roberts, more vicious this time. He threatened to expose her financial struggles, told her he knew exactly where she and Eric lived, even hinted that accidents could happen if she continued to refuse cooperation. Shaken, she called Daniel. He immediately insisted on sending security to her apartment building. Though it felt surreal to see a discreet but imposing guard stationed near her front door, it also gave her a sense of relief. With each passing day, the legal net closed around Pierce, but the tension ratcheted higher. Claire felt like a character in a novel about power and corruption. Only this was real life. Her life. And yet, in the midst of all that pressure, her bond with Daniel deepened. She caught glimpses of the man behind the polished CEO facade, the man who, despite a fearsome reputation, could extend genuine kindness. She suspected he rarely allowed himself such openness, and the trust he placed in her was humbling. One afternoon, as she was methodically dusting the baseboards in a hallway, she heard a group of junior executives gossiping a few steps away. They were talking about Daniel's rumored late-night brainstorming sessions, his occasional absences from high-level social events, and, her ears perked, his alleged interest in some low-level staffer. Her heart thudded. She realized they were talking about her, speculating that she might be angling for an executive payday, or trying to climb the corporate ladder using personal connections. She felt a sting of humiliation. She'd never asked for special treatment. She wanted to shout at them to mind their own business, but she simply stayed out of sight, letting the gossip swirl. After they left, she slumped against the wall, sighing heavily. Office rumors were the last thing she needed. Maybe she should keep more distance from Daniel, protect both of them from the rumor mill. But she couldn't deny how his support had enabled her to stand firm against Pierce's intimidation, and she felt a genuine warmth when they talked. Something that went beyond mere gratitude. That evening, Eric noticed her mood. "You look upset, sis," he said quietly, frowning from where he rested on the couch. "It's work drama," she admitted, sinking beside him. "People talk, make assumptions. It's silly." Eric gave her a wry smile. "Let them talk, right? You do what's best for you, for us." She squeezed his hand. "Yeah, you're right. It's just tough sometimes." Over the next few days, the rumor mill churned with renewed energy. Claire tried to ignore it, but it was impossible not to notice the sidelong glances, the hushed whispers that died the moment she entered the room. Still, she had more pressing concerns. The lawsuit against Pierce was about to be filed, and she would likely be called as a witness. The legal documents named her as someone who had received direct attempts at bribery and intimidation. Facing him in court felt terrifying, but also like a step toward justice. Her tension peaked one chilly morning when she arrived at the building to find a swirl of commotion in the lobby. Security officers were escorting out a furious-looking man in a suit. Claire's heart jolted as she recognized him from media photos. Leonard Pierce himself, his face twisted with rage. He caught sight of her, and their eyes locked for a moment, a flash of shock and venom crossing his features. She froze under his glare, gripping the handle of her cleaning cart so hard her knuckles turned white. "Daniel Sheridan is going to regret this." Pierce spat at nobody in particular, his voice reverberating through the marble lobby. Security hustled him out, ignoring his protests. Claire's entire body trembled. She sensed something pivotal was unfolding. Moments later, Daniel appeared at the top of the lobby's sweeping staircase. His expression was unreadable, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. Claire stood rooted to the spot as he descended toward her. "It's done," he said quietly, stopping a few steps away. "He tried to pull some last-minute stunt, but the complaint is already filed. The authorities have him under scrutiny. If all goes well, he'll be charged with multiple counts: fraud, coercion, attempted blackmail. They're just beginning to unravel the extent of his crimes." She looked over at the glass doors, where Pierce had just been shoved out onto the sidewalk. "What about his threats?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "We've requested official protection for you and anyone else who testifies. My legal team is prepared for a fight." He lowered his voice, adding, "I'm sorry it had to come to this, but now that he's cornered, he'll be desperate." She nodded, not trusting her voice. A swirl of relief, dread, triumph, and fear clamored inside her. Daniel's gaze gentled as he noticed her pallor. "I'll walk you to the staff lounge," he offered. "You're shaking." She allowed him to guide her to a quiet alcove near the elevators, where they sat on a small bench. A couple of curious onlookers drifted by, but he shot them a glare that made them scurry off. Claire leaned forward, pressing her palms to her forehead. "I didn't think it would feel this real," she whispered. "I didn't think we'd actually push him to a point where he might get arrested." Daniel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Your testimony will be crucial. The more evidence we have, the less chance he has of wriggling out of it." She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I'll do whatever I can." "Thank you," he said softly. Then he glanced around, remembering their surroundings. He withdrew his hand, clearing his throat. "Let's get you a cup of tea or something. You need a moment to breathe." They spent a few minutes in the lounge, sipping tea from disposable cups. She felt the warmth seep into her chest, calming her nerves little by little. Daniel sat beside her, occasionally checking his phone for updates from the legal team. He had never seemed more human to her than he did in that moment. Anxious, protective, determined. She thought about how radically her life had changed since the day she interrupted that meeting. It wasn't just about losing or keeping her job anymore. It was about justice, about standing up to a manipulative titan like Pierce, about ensuring Eric's future. She murmured, "I keep wondering, if my father had someone warn him about the investor who ruined our small town, maybe things would have turned out differently. Maybe we wouldn't have lost everything." Daniel turned off his phone, focusing on her. You never told me the full story. She rubbed her arms, recalling the painful memories. Dad ran a local hardware store. It wasn't huge, but it served our town well. This investor came in with sweet promises of revitalizing the area. My father trusted him, invested in expansions, but after the investor pulled out abruptly, Dad was left with huge debts. He lost the store. We moved away shortly after, hoping to find better opportunities elsewhere. Then Dad fell into a depression he never recovered from. We lost him 2 years later. Daniel's eyes flickered with empathy. I'm so sorry. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Maybe stopping Pierce from doing the same to others is the best way to honor your father's memory. Her throat tightened with emotion. That's exactly how I feel, she managed, blinking back tears. They shared a moment of understanding. Then with a rueful half smile, Daniel stood. I have a press conference to handle soon. We're going public about the lawsuit, but we won't mention your name, of course. You'll remain an anonymous witness for your protection. After that, I have a meeting with the Attorney General's office. Claire stood too, bracing herself. I guess I should get back to work. Mopping floors might be the best way to distract myself. His lips curved in a small smile. Take whatever time you need. If you want to go home early, do so. Full pay. You've earned it. Thank you, she said, voice subdued but appreciative. As he left, she felt an odd pang of warmth. Maybe office gossip would never cease, but she knew the sincerity behind his gestures. And for the first time in a very long while, she felt a sense of pride in her own courage. The legal battle kicked off the following day with statements filed at the courthouse, naming Pierce and several of his associates. News outlets ran stories about suspected fraud and intimidation attempts. Claire's phone buzzed non-stop with updates from the legal team. She would have to give a recorded statement soon, possibly appear in court if the case advanced that far. Her anxiety spiked at the thought of being questioned on a witness stand. But Daniel assured her he'd have top-notch attorneys guiding her. Meanwhile, Eric's health stayed precarious. Some nights, she worried he might need to be rushed to the hospital, but they couldn't afford anything beyond basic urgent care. One evening, Daniel called just to check on them, the sound of genuine concern in his voice. She told him about Eric's last medical scare, and by morning she found out that her new insurance plan, still unofficial for most employees, had been expedited in her case. An email arrived stating that her coverage now included more extensive treatment options. She stared at the screen, tears slipping down her cheeks as gratitude and disbelief intermingled. Though the tension of the lawsuit weighed heavily, that expanded coverage was a beacon of hope. She scheduled an appointment with a specialist for Eric, praying they might find a more effective treatment plan. For the first time, the dark cloud hovering over them seemed to lift slightly. Yet she knew the real trial lay ahead, confronting Pierce in a legal setting. And beneath that, there was another current, no less significant for being unspoken, the growing closeness between her and Daniel. Each was aware of it in fleeting glances, in rare smiles, in the hush of a hallway where neither hurried away as quickly as before. For now, they left it unaddressed, overshadowed by the conflict at hand. But it lingered, a subtle undercurrent in every conversation. As she prepped for her recorded statement, Claire spent hours with a lawyer going over every detail of Pierce's bribe attempts. She recounted the phone calls, the text messages, the sense of being watched or followed. With each repetition, she grew more certain of what needed to be done, though her nerves were stretched taut. On the day of her deposition, Daniel arranged for a car to pick her up, along with 2 private security guards to ensure no one interfered. She appreciated the protective measures but felt uneasy about how much had changed in so short a time. Her recorded testimony was nerve-wracking but straightforward. She answered every question carefully, mindful that opposing counsel would scrutinize every word. The attorneys assured her she'd done well, praising her clarity and courage. Exhausted but relieved, she emerged from the small legal office to find Daniel waiting in the lobby, pacing. When he saw her, he stopped, tension draining from his posture. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. She let out a shaky exhale. "I told them everything. It was scary, but the lawyer said it was solid testimony. I hope it helps. He nodded, sliding his hands into his pockets. I'm sure it did. They stepped outside together into the chilly afternoon air. A swirl of city noises rushed around them. But for a moment, it felt as though they stood in stillness. Daniel hesitated, looking as though he wanted to say more, do more, but they were surrounded by the bustle of pedestrians. Instead, he led her to the waiting car. Before she got in, she mustered the courage to stand on her tiptoes and plant a light kiss on his cheek. It was a spontaneous gesture of gratitude that surprised even herself. She pulled back, face warm, and found him staring at her with an unreadable expression. Then quietly he smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile she'd rarely seen. She ducked into the car, leaving him standing there in the grey light of downtown, hand lifting briefly as if to wave. The door shut behind her and the driver pulled into traffic. Claire's heart beat wildly and she half expected to regret that brief moment of intimacy. But as the car merged onto a busy thoroughfare, weaving past taxis and buses, she felt more certain than ever that a new chapter of her life was unfolding. One shaped by the choice to stand up for what was right, by the kindness of a man whose life she'd once disrupted in a conference room, and by the fragile hope that out of the turmoil, something good and true was emerging.